All right, Chevron on Zoom, we're still good? Excellent. All right, Shabbos say good morning, good morning. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Shvat, Mrs. Bracha Strimber, for dedicating all the Shurman Drashos this month in memory of her husband Avi Avram Ben Kalman Eliezer Halevi Zichron Livracha. To thank Ayal and Sarah Steinberg for dedicating all the Shurman Drashos this month. This was for Shalima, for Shulamis Bas Susha. And to thank our Day of Learning sponsors, Yehuda and Bracha Buchwalter, Lezecher Nishmas Yehuda's father, Asher Zelig Ben Yaakov Yehuda Halevi, Zichron Livracha. I'll tell you that the Levaya was yesterday for Rabbi Yehuda's father, was a survivor of Buchenwald. It was a very, very, very moving tribute to a very special man. And Chevra, if you have Yehuda sits right behind you. Right, Yehuda sits right over here. So Chevra, he'll be sitting Shiva. I think I'll try to send out the information. If not, if I don't send it, it's on Baltimore Jewish Life, but I'll send it out in the group. It's Kedai, even if you have a little bit of time, sometime over the next week to stop in to pay a Shiva visit. I know it will be very much appreciated. So we'll say, let's go. Today's daf is daf Dal. We have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. We left off at the Mishnah. We'll say great Mishnah today. Great Mishnah. So Mishnah says, Harini Nazir minachartsanim o minazagim. Listen to this case. A person says, I am a Nazir from grape seeds. From grape seeds. And I will say, so just to understand, in general, a neder naziris, I will say, it's always interesting like this because Masechtas often don't begin or almost never begin with like a comprehensive overview of the particular halacha that we're discussing. So remember again, when a person becomes a Nazir, they essentially have an obligation to abstain not just from wine, but from grapes and any grape product. So that includes the grape skins, the grape seeds, wine, old wine, new wine. And again, then of course there's hair cutting and contamination with the dead, right? Coming in close contact with a corpse. That's the general halachos of Naziros. Now in this case, something very interesting happened over here. Harini Nazir min hachartzanim. This guy, I will say this was the formulation of his neder. He said, I am a Nazir from grape seeds. I'm abstaining from grape seeds. Okay. Mina zogim, or grape skins, or mina taglachas, or from hair cutting, or mina toma, or I'm not going to become tummy. And I will say, now what's happened in this case? This guy's articulated his neder naziros, but it's only included one isser. So what sounds like what he's saying over here is, I'm going to be a Nazir in this one way. In this one way. I'm not going to eat grape seeds. Okay, I'm a Nazir, like that. So we'll say, now what's the halacha? So, Harei Nazir v'chol diktuki naziras alav. And we'll say, you bought the farm. Oh, that's the wrong expression, right? You bought the farm. Okay, whatever it is. Right? You got the whole thing. You got the whole thing. Once you say Hareini Nazir, even if you qualify it with this or with that, ultimately, again, you are a Nazir, and all of the details of Naziros are upon you. So the Gemara says this as well. Say, so Masnisin, very interesting halacha. Masnisin below Rabbi Shimon. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Shimon. How so? Because the sign of Rabbi Shimon Omer, Eno Chayiv Achider Mekulam. Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, you only become a Nazir when you choose to abstain from all of these items. Right? In other words, we'll say Rabbi Shimon holds that partial abstention or partial prohibition does not create a comprehensive neder nazirus. It is only if a person articulates the fact that he's going to abstain from all of these things that he truly becomes a Nazir. Rabbanan say, "Afilo lo nazar ela bechad minhon havi Nazir." The Rabbanan will say, reflect the view in our Mishnah, which is no, even if you just go ahead and abstain from one of these things, ultimately what? You are a Nazir. Even abstention from one of these things creates a comprehensive neder nazirus. So let's analyze. So my time with Reb Shimon, what's Reb Shimon's logic? So we'll say Reb Shimon who holds that if you just abstain from one of these items, you do not become a complete Nazir. What's Reb Shimon's logic? Listen to this. Amakra, mikol asher yaseh, migefen hayayin, mechartsonim viad zag. So we'll say Reb Shimon's logic seems to be like this. The pasuk itself indicates mikol asher yaseh. In other words, in order to become a Nazir, what do you have to abstain from? From everything. From everything. And therefore, abstaining from only one thing does not create a neder nazirus. So the Gemara says, Rabbanah my time. So what's Rabbanah's logic? Amakra, miyayin v'sheichar yazir. Now, we'll say, I'll point out, in this context, yayin and sheichar means new wine and aged wine. right? Or new wine, aged wine, right? So just yayin and sheikhar. So we'll say sometimes sheikhar refers to other intoxicating beverages. In this case, because remember again, could a Nazir have a beer? Nazir have a beer? I would say after a long day of Naziros, there's nothing you need more than a cold one, right? So I'll say, so Lamaisa, right? So Lamaisa again, so sheikhar in this context does not mean a beer, right? Or any intoxicating beverage. Although we will see a machlokis about that. But Lamaisa, for our purposes now, yayin and sheikhar are just two different types of wine. So the Rabbanon will say, mi yayin v'sheikhar yazir. You see from here, that's what? That when it comes to the Nazir, the Torah says, from yayin and sheikhar. Now, yayin and sheikhar is one element of the Naziros. So you see that according to the Rabbanon, even articulating abstention from one element of Naziros ultimately again makes you a Nazir. So we'll say, so this is the fundamental machlokes of Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanon. And again, this is the case of the Mishnah. And I have a guy, I make a neder Naziros, but the way I articulate my neder Naziros is, I'm a Nazir, and that I'm going to abstain from grape skins. Okay, so what does that do? So our Mishnah / the Rabbanan say that's fine. Partial abstention of Naziros creates a comprehensive neder Naziros. On the other hand, Rabbi Shimon holds no. You have to mamish go ahead and abstain from everything in order to be able to create Naziros. Now, we'll say, now I just want to point out, according to Rabbi Shimon, let's say a person just said Harini Nazir, but doesn't include anything else. Are you a Nazir? Yes. So remember again, according to Rabbi Shimon, the only time you get into a problem is when you begin to identify certain things. In other words, once you're going to begin to identify, then you have to identify everything. I'm a Nazir from grape skins, grape seeds, grapes, new wine, old wine, hair cutting. If you don't say anything, you just say already Nazir, then of course that is a comprehensive statement. Fine. So the Gemara says as follows. Rabbi Shimon, so we'll say now the Gemara asks each other opinion about the other's pasuk. Rabbi Shimon, Nami Haksim Yayin V'Sheichar. What does Rabbi Shimon do with the phrase Yayin V'Sheichar? This is incredible. Homi Baile, Lesser Yayin Mitzvah, Ki Yayin Harashos. This is great. According to Rabbi Shimon, that phrase teaches me that a Nazir is not permitted to drink mitzvah wine in the same way that he's not permitted to drink optional wine, rishus wine. Now we'll say, what's mahi? What's mitzvah wine? Kiddushta va'avdalta. Yayin, the wine for yayin, the wine for kiddush and avdallah. So, right, one might have thought that perhaps an neder Naziris creates a prohibition ultimately on what? On I will call it optional wine, yayin rishus. Kamashmala, no, it creates an isser even on yayin mitzvah. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Hare mushava omer alav mehar Sinai. And I will say there's a machlokes, Rashi and the Rush, about how to read this phrase. So we'll say we're going to go with the Rush's idea over here, that the Gemara is essentially saying, of course the neder Naziros goes ahead and covers wine for Kiddush and Avdallah. What do you think? Are you under obligation? Right? Is it a biblical obligation to go ahead and drink wine for Kiddush and Havdalah? And of course, we'll say the answer to that is no. In other words, it's not a din da'oraisa to use wine for Kiddush and Havdalah. You have to make it's a din da'oraisa to make Kiddush and Havdalah. But Kiddush and Havdalah can be accomplished in a variety of different ways that doesn't require wine. So it goes without saying, of course, that the neder Nazirus is going to go ahead and overpower the rabbinic need for wine for Kiddush and Avdallah. Ella, Kiada Amarava, and I both say this is brought down as a proof. Kiada Amarava, Shvua She'eshta, well, listen to this. Let's say a person makes a Shvua, we'll get to Shvuas, makes an oath that he's going to drink wine. It's an interesting oath, right? I swear I'm going to drink wine. And then I will say, what happens? I will say, Dalet Amadalav, second line from the top, the Chazir V'Amar Hareini Nazir. And then what happens? He comes along and he says, I'm a Nazir. So we'll say, very interesting case. So you see now our what's our tension? I made a Shvua to drink wine. And now what? I made a neder, effectively what? Not to drink wine. So we'll say, what's the relationship between my neder Naziros and my Shvua? It's not a problem. Asa Naziros v'chayle al Shvua. Rabbi say the neder Naziros comes along and what? The neder Naziros comes and it's chal on top of the Shvua, which is another way of saying the neder Naziros pushes aside the Shvua. But Abana, so we'll say, so therefore again, so we'll pause here for just a moment. So according to Rabbi Shimon, the whole phrase of Yayin v'Sheichar, right? Yayin v'Sheichar Yazir, that phrase teaches me that when a person becomes a Nazir, Not only is he not permitted to drink what we call yayin rishos, we'll call optional wine, but the neder nazirus even precludes him from drinking mitzvah wine. Mitzvah wine, right? There was the Havamina would have been neder nazirus is not chal on any wine that's a mitzvah. Kamash malon, no, the Nazir can't even drink mitzvah wine. Incredible. Rabbanan nami haimi baile, lesser yain mitzvah kain rishos. So I will say, according to the Rabbanan, so remember again, I will say, the Rabbanan ultimately used the phrase, the Rabbanan go ahead and use the phrase miyain v'shechar to teach you that what? Originally to teach us that even if you make a neder naziros, just abstaining from one thing, that creates a comprehensive neder naziros. But now the Gemara said, 1 second. Don't Rabbanan need miyayin v'shechar also to teach you that a neder naziris precludes you from drinking mitzvah wine as well? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Imkain limakra miyayin. The pasuk could have just said miyayin, my v'shechar. Why does it add in v'shechar? Shamis mina tarti. Rabbi say to teach me two things. Teach me two things. What are the two things? Rabbi say number one. So according to the Rabbanan, number one halacha, number one, that if you articulate a neder naziris, only prohibiting to yourself one thing from the neder naziros, what does that do? It creates a comprehensive neder naziros. That's number one. And number two, the additional word sheikhar also teaches me that it's not just optional wine that becomes asr under neder naziros, but rather what? Even mitzvah wine as well. Incredible. Rabbi Shimon, hainu taimad dekasiv sheikhar la'alufe sheikhar lemikdash. I will say, so now I will say, remember, we're just kind of ping-ponging back and forth in the drushes. So according to the Rabbanon, the extra sheikhar comes to teach me that lamaisa, again, even mitzvah wine is prohibited. I, Rabbi Shimon, according to you, why do you need the word sheikhar? Why do you need the word sheikhar? So I will say, this is very interesting. Listen to this. So Rabbi Shimon, hainu taimid dekasiv sheikhar, the extra word sheikhar comes to teach me, la'alufi sheikhar lemikdash. Wow. I will say, watch this. To go ahead and teach me a very interesting Gezer Shava of Sheikhar to the Beis HaMikdash. Now I will say, what's the Gezer Shava? Watch this. D'chsiv Yain v'Sheikhar al teisht. Because I will say, the pasuk says, Yain v'Sheikhar al teisht. So remember again, this pasuk, 1 second, the pasuk of Yain v'Sheikhar al tov v'nechitcha. I will say, this Yain v'Sheikhar is by the Kohanim. Right? So this pasuk is Yain v'Sheikhar al teisht ato uvanecha itach bevoachem al oha moed. So v'lo samusu chukas al darosechem. So we'll say, so Yain v'Sheikhar al teisht is a pasuk said to Aaron and his sons, do not come into the mikdash under the influence. Right? There's no avoda under the influence. Fine. Yain v'Sheikhar al teisht ato uvanecha itcha. Ma gabe Nazir. Silmar says, listen to this. So it says Yain v'Sheikhar by Nazir, and it says Yain v'Sheikhar by Avoda in the Beis HaMikdash. Watch this. Ma gabe Nazir, Yain hu delissar, aval shar mashkin lo. Now, boss, this is very interesting. So by Nazir, remember again, we just said before, what is a Nazir not allowed to drink? What is he not allowed to drink? Wine, right? But a Nazir, for example, is allowed to drink other intoxicating beverages, right? So the Gemara says like this, just, Rabbi Shimon says, just like by Nazir, Yain v'Sheikhar means dafka, wine, new wine and old wine, afka be mikdash, so too by the Beis HaMikdash, where the prohibition for the Kohanim to do the avodah under the influence says Yain v'Sheikhar, it also applies to what? So nami Yain hu delissar aval shar mashkin hamistakrin lo. And I will say, but other intoxicating beverages are not asur. I will say, which is incredibly fascinating. So this is Rabbi Shimon's drasha of Yain v'Sheikhar. This is what he needs the Sheikhar for. Creates a Gezer Shava between Nazir and what we call Shtuye Yain, doing avoda under the influence. Just like by Nazir, Yain v'Sheikhar teaches me the prohibition is only wine, so too for the Beis HaMikdash, the prohibition of doing the avoda while under the influence of alcohol is only wine and does not apply to other intoxicating beverages. Ula'afuke with Rabbi Yehuda. I will say the Gemara says, but just important full disclosure, there is another opinion here. There is another opinion. Who's the other opinion? Right, Rabbi Yehuda. What is it? The sign Rabbi Yehuda says, Achol devei lakil. That's what else is incredible. Rabbi Yehuda says, if you ate a cake of pressed figs, or v'shasa dvash, or you drank honey, v'chalav or milk, v'nichnas lemikdash, and you did the avodah beis hamikdash, chayiv. Now listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that there are other things which have an intoxicating effect on a person. Apparently, cake of pressed figs, right? Honey, right? A cup of honey, right? Or a cup of warm milk, right? These are things that have an intoxicating effect as well. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if you drink these things and go into the Beis Hamikdash and do the avoda, you are chayiv. So I just want to point out what's happening over here. All we're doing right now, is just going back and forth in the drashas. But from this last one, it's very interesting. What does Rabbi Shimon do with sheichar? He creates a construct. He creates a gzeir shava, ultimately between Nazir and shtuye yayin, right? Drinking alcohol before doing the avoda. Just like by Nazir, the only prohibition ultimately again is on wine. So too by the avoda, according to Rabbi Shimon, the only prohibition is on wine. Rabbi Yehuda says absolutely not true. The prohibition for kohanim is anything which will have some type of intoxicating effect. And what's the chiddush? We'll say what's the chiddush? Even if it's totally non-alcoholic. Even if it's totally non-alcoholic. Incredible. Shabbos say, the Gemara goes weiter. Shabbos say, so again, I just want to point out, our primary machlokes that's still driving this entire discussion is the machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanon. Namely, again, which is really rooted in our Mishnah, a person takes a neder nazirus, but all a person says in that neder nazirus is what? That he abstains from one thing. Right? This is our Mishnah. Right? I'm a Nazir from grape seeds. So our Mishnah says, if you make a partial declaration like that, you are in fact a complete Nazir. The Gemara just points out this is a machlokes Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanon. Okay, so let's go weiter. Ibai Sema, Rabbi says another possibility. Ibai Sema, Rabbi Shimon lesle isser chal al isser. Rabbi say could very well be that Rabbi Shimon himself, and now we're getting into a fascinating idea of isser chal al isser. We've seen this concept before, namely, when you have something that is prohibited, can you superimpose another layer of prohibition upon an already existing prohibition? I will say, now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over Ibais Ema, it's probably about 15 lines up from before the lines get wide, like the middle wide lines. Ibais Ema, Hainu Tavid Rabbi Shimon da Amar Eno Chai ben Nazirus, Achi Yazer Mikulan Bistam. Rabbi says, now the Gemara is suggesting another svara for Rabbi Shimon. Why is it that Rabbi Shimon himself holds that halacha l'maisa, if you just say, let's just go through the case. According to Rabbi Shimon, I say, Hareini Nazir mina chartsanim. I say, I'm a Nazir from grape seeds. According to Rabbi Shimon, what's the halacha? I'm not a Nazir. So we'll say the Gemara is making an amazing observation over here. Let's look at Rashi first, then we'll read in the Gemara, because Rashi actually provides an incredible explanation. Ibai Sema, Hanu Tab Rabbi Shimon. What's Rabbi Shimon's logic? The Amar Eino Chayiv ben Nazirus Achi Yazer Mikulan. Why is it Rabbi Shimon holds that you're not a Nazir unless, of course, you abstain, right, from everything? Listen to this. Bistam the Amar Harini Nazir. Rabbi Shimon the Tamei the Lesle Isser Chalal Isser. Because perhaps Rabbi Shimon does not hold that one Isser could be chal on another Isser. So I'll say, watch this. V'haganami, this is incredible. Ki Yaser Atzal min achartsanim u'min azogin v'chayle alei Nazirus lo asi idach palga to taglachas v'toma v'chayle iluye. Inami ki hizir asam min hayayin lo asi isser taglachas. Supposed to listen to this. This is incredible. Rabbi Shimon says like this. Here's the problem. When you go ahead and you say Harini Nazir, let's just go with the Mishnah's example. Harini Nazir min achartsanim. I'm a Nazir from grape seeds. According to Rabbi Shimon Abosai, what does that create in that moment? That potentially could create an isser for grape seeds. For argument's sake. What's the problem now? The problem is there's all these other aspects of Nazirus. But I will say the issue is that those other aspects of Nazirus cannot devolve upon you. Why not? Because ain isser halal isser. Because Lamaisa, since you already created a quasi isser Nazirus for yourself, the rest of the Isurei Nazirus cannot come upon you because ain isser halal isser. I will say this is dramatic. So I just want to point out, in the first version of Rabbi Shimon, what we're saying is, when you say Hareini Nazir mina chartsanim, what's the effect of that statement? In the first version of Rabbi Shimon, what's the effect? Nothing. Like it doesn't do anything. In this version of what we're saying is, no, it does do something. What does it do? It creates a localized Isra of chartsanim. Fine. The problem is now the rest of the Nazirus cannot devolve upon you. Why? Ein Isser Chal Al Isser. ultimately, again, I will say one prohibition cannot devolve upon another prohibition. Absolutely incredible. So I'll say back, let's see now in the Gemara. Ibay Seima, Rabbi Shimon, let's say Isra Halal Isser, Tisanya. Rabbi Shimon will say, now where do we see that Rabbi Shimon? This is a great case. Ha'omer, I mean, it's not a great case, it's a terrible case, but it's an interesting case. Ha'ochel nevela b'yom kippurim. Someone eats non-kosher meat, an nevela on Yom Kippur. So remember again, nevela is an animal that died without shechita. So now remember, a person eats an nevela on Yom Kippur, potter. Now say it's pretty wild, right? Why is he potter? Now listen to this. In other words, you're potter on Yom Kippur. Now say this is presupposing that. So now let's say you have an animal that's in nevela. Let's assume for a moment the animal was in nevela even before Yom Kippur. So now what happens? The animal was already aser. So when I eat that animal, I'm eating nevela. So because the nevela isser was already there, Yom Kippur isser cannot devolve upon me as well. So this is the concept of ein isser chal al isser. So you see that Rabbi Shimon holds of this concept. So I might have thought Rabbi said that the same halacha applies over here. Namely, I go ahead, I make a neder, right? Hareini nazir mina chartzanim. I'm a nazir from chartzanim. Fine. So according to Rabbi Shimon, now what happens? That level of Nazirus devolves upon me. Now there's an Isser. What happens now? Ein Isser Chal Isser. The rest of the Nazirus cannot devolve. Now both say, it's an incredible Chiddush. It's an incredible Chiddush, this notion of partial devolvement of Isurei Nazirus. But again, it's a Hamamina. Fascinating. To which the Gemara says, Ul Rabbanon Ami Haksiv, Mikol Asher Yaseh Migefan Ayayin. So we'll say fine. So that's just say interpretation of Rabbi Shimon. Now the Gemara is going back to the Rabbanon. What do the Rabbanon do with Rabbi Shimon's pasuk? Right? According to the Rabbanon, the pasuk also says Mikol Asher Yaseh Migefan Ayayin. That was Rabbi Shimon's pasuk. The Rabbanon Hasam Limet Ali Surei Nazir Shemitztarfim Zem Zeh. We'll say we're going, and we'll get into all of this later on in Mir Hashem. From here we learn that the different Isurim of Nazir have the ability to combine with one another. We'll say, for example, at what point in time is a Nazir in violation, or at what point in time does a Nazir violate his neder nazirus? So we'll say, let's assume for a moment when it comes to grapes, after he eats a kizayis of grapes. According to the Rabbanon, the pasuk of Mikol Asher Yaseh Migefan Ayayin means different grape materials combined to form the requisite shear. In other words, you don't need to eat a kazayis of grape seeds or a kazayis of grape skins, or for that matter, again, we'll see how to combine solid measures with liquid measures, right? Because for wine it may be a kizay, a revius. We'll see all of this, right? But lamaisa, you could combine different grape materials in order to be able to combine the requisite shear. Rabbi Shimon, let's say Rabbi Shimon rejects this idea. He holds that you can't combine. This idea, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Kol Shuhu Lamakos. Rabbi Shimon says, if a Nazir eats any amount of grape material, drinks any amount of wine, gets malchus, Lo Amr Kizayis Ela Inyan Karban. He says Kizayis is only necessary to spark or to generate carbonic liability. Again, we'll see that sugi later on. So we'll say, how do we paskin? Let's get back. Let's close this out. Again, I will say, fascinating Gemara, riveting Gemara, just because also we learn things about the Beis Hamikdash. We learn things ultimately about Isra Chal Al Isra, which we know is a major fundamental machlokas. So we'll say, so ultimately, how do we paskin in this case over here? So now, let's very specific. I make a neder naziros. And what's my neder naziros? I say I'm a nazir from chartzanim. I'm a nazir from grape seeds. What does that statement do? So we'll say the Rambam in Hilchos Naziros, Parak Aleph Halacha Tes says as follows. So Omer, Haredi Nazir min chartzanim bilvad. I'm only a nazir from grape skins or from grapes, right? Or he gives all the examples. I'm only a nazir from cutting my hair. I'm only a nazir from coming in contact with the dead. What's talach? I will say, get ready, here it is. Hare ze nazir gomer. The Rambam Paskin is like the Rabbanon, that a partial declaration of Naziros, ultimately, again, you bought the whole thing. You bought the whole thing. V'chol dikduki Naziros alav, v'afal pi shelo hayabaliba lahazir elami davar zeh. Now, both say, now the chiddush of this is, let's say, but in my mind, my kavanah really was, just that I've been meaning to cut back on grape skins for a long time now, right? So that's why I think the neder nazirus just to cut back on grape skins. That was my kavanah. Doesn't make a difference. Once you articulate Haredi Nazir, you're in. You're in. Even if you actively say, I'm only a Nazir from this one, you are in. You are now a Nazir. You are now a Nazir. Incredible. So that is the halacha. So I'll just tell you, interestingly enough, when it comes to Isser Chalal Isser, I've often thought about this idea. I will say that it's about machlokes in halacha. In hashkaf rabosai, I've often thought we paskin iser chal al iser, which means what? Sometimes in life, rabosai, you could compound your mistakes. Iser chal al iser means you can pile mistakes on top of mistakes. And I will say sometimes in life, we have a certain midah, a certain character trait that's negative, or a certain behavior that's detrimental, or a certain approach, or a certain mindset. And I know that it's not good. But often what ends up happening, instead of going ahead and finding the courage to address it or to deal with it, what do? I just double down. I just double down and I just refuse to deal with it or acknowledge it or address it or somehow find a way to work through it. Shabbosai, that's Isser Chalal Isser. Sometimes the Isurim just keep piling on, right? The negativity keeps piling on, which is why it's so incredibly important that if I know that there's something detrimental in my behavior, in my attitude, in my approach, to deal with it. Because if I don't deal with it, only one thing happens, which is it just simply gets worse. Isser Chalal Isser. Let's go back to Mishnah. Hareini Kishimshon B'Marach. So also we're going to get into some really fascinating sugyas now. I am like Shimshon. I will say, we are going to discuss that in a world of Naziros, there are different forms of Naziros. I will say, so we've been dealing with what we call a typical Naziros. There's also something called Naziros Olam, eternal Naziros. There's also something called Naziros Shimshon. All right, a Shimshon Naziros. Now, remember again, this is Shimshon from the Navi, Shimshon from Shoftim. Right, Shimshon, Shimshon was remember, we're going to see, Shimshon was a very unique Nazir, Shimshon was a very unique individual, right, but a very unique Nazir. So again, we're going to discuss all of these things. So right now, we don't yet know the distinction between these different types of Naziros, but right now, here's what the Mishnah says. So, Harini Keshimshon, I am like Shimshon, or Keben Manoach. I will say, remember again, Shimshon's father was Manoach. Right? So I say I'm like Shimshon, or I say, these are all different statements. I'm like Ben Manoach, or Kibal Delilah, or I'm like the husband of Delilah, Shimshon's wife, Delilah. Right? Kimisha Akar Daltos Aza. I'm like the guy who uprooted the doorposts of Aza. We'll say this is the end of the Shimshon story, right? When he's held captive by the Plishtim. And remember again, he uproots the pillars, essentially in the Philistine Colosseum, and brings down the entire thing. So I say, I'm like the guy who uprooted the doorways. I'm like the guy who the Plishtim gouged out his eyes. All right, that one is a little bit too intense, right? They'll say, but because remember again, Shimshon has his eyes gouged out by the Plishtim. Shabbos say, what's that? Hareze Nazir Shimshon. You make statements like this, you have become a Shimshon Nazir. A Shimshon Nazir. And I will say, we don't know what it means to be a Shimshon Nazir. That's actually the next sugya. But these articulations are enough to make me a Shimshon Nazir. Says the Gemara, Lamli lemisna kal halein. So we'll say, why do you need all of these descriptors, right? In other words, if I say I'm like Shimshon, I'm like the son of Manoach, I'm like the husband of Delilah, I'm like the one who uprooted the doorways in Aza, I'm like the one who the Plishtim took out his eyes. Well, why do you need all of this? Also, it's actually very interesting. The Gemara says, Tzrichi, di amaharini kishimshon. I will say, you know why? Because the truth is, you need all of them. In other words, if I say harini kishimshon, well, let's see, you need all of them. In other words, you need all of these terms. Why? Di amaharini kishimshon. Because if I just say I'm like Shimshon, hava amina Shimshon achrina. Let's say I just say that what? There's another guy, Shimshon, right? Oh yeah, Shimshon down the block, right? I was like, I always wanted to be like Shimshon, right? So Kamash Malon ki ben Manoach. No, but that's why you add in ki Shimshon ben Manoach. The Gemara says, "V'itana ki ben Manoach hava mina ika demiskari hachi." I might have said, well, there are guys who are named. I'm sure there are Jews named Shimshon ben Manoach. So once again, maybe I'm just saying I want to be like that guy, Shimshon ben Manoach. Right? Kamash Malon ki bal Delilah. I will say, therefore, again, the Mishnah adds in, like the husband of Delilah, ukemoshe nikru plishtim esin. So I will say, the idea over here is that if you undertake for yourself a Naziros Shimshon, a Shimshon Naziros, the way to do that, I will say, is to be as specific as possible in that statement. So again, you don't have to say all of these things. I'm going to be like, I want Hareini Nazir Kishimshon ben Manoach, the husband of Delilah, who uprooted the doorposts in Aza, whose eyes were gouged out by the Plishtim. Exhausting, right? So you don't have to say all of that, right? But Lamaisi, you have to say enough so that it's clear what it is that you are undertaking. Incredible. Now let's say Mishnah. Here we go. Ma bein Nazir olam Nazir Shimshon. So we'll say now we're being introduced to these different constructs of Naziros. What is the difference between an eternal Nazir and a Nazir Shimshon? Here's the difference. Nazir Olam Hichbid Saro. We'll say, what we'll call, I say an eternal Nazir. Eternal is the wrong word. Lifetime Nazir. Right? What's the difference between a lifetime Naziros and a Naziros of Shimshon? So by a lifetime Naziros, so Nazir Olam Hichbid Saro, if your hair becomes too heavy, Mekil Batar, you could cut off some of it with a razor. Now, we'll say we're going to see it's dafka razor, not scissors. Not scissors. You could cut it off with a razor, maybe shalosh behemos, and you bring a carbon. Every single time you get a trim, right? A trim could only be done, first of all, when your hair becomes too heavy. That's number one. Number two, only with a razor, not with scissors. Number three, there are carbonos that are brought every single time you lighten your hair. The nitma, furthermore, if you become tameh, maybe carbon tuma. You have to bring a carbon tuma. On the flip side, Nazir Shimshon, if you are a Shimshon Nazir, if your hair becomes too heavy, Eino Mekel, too bad. Too bad, right? You cannot do anything to lighten the hair. Nitma, furthermore, if you become tameh, eno maybe carbon tumah. You don't bring carbon tumah. So we're going to see something amazing, that it could very well be that a Shimshon Nazirus does not have the tumas mace element associated with it. Again, we'll see all of this. So let's go. Nazir Olam and the Kasher. First of all, the Gemara says, who brought up Nazir Olam? Where did this come from? Where did this come from? A lifetime Nazirus? To which the Gemara says, the truth is, the Mishnah was missing a piece, I will say, and here it is. So Omer Harini Nazir Olam, if a person makes a statement, I will say, I am a lifetime Nazir. You can undertake a vow like this, I'm a lifetime Nazir. So what's the halacha? Hare ze Nazir. Okay, I will say, such a vow works. Such a vow works. Ma bein Nazir Olam Nazir Shimshon. So I will say, now, we don't know what a Nazir Shimshon is either. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But what's the distinction between a Nazir Olam and Nazir Shimshon? Here it is. Now the Mishnah says, Nazir Olam Hichbit Sara Mekel Batar. So we'll say, a Nazir Olam, a lifetime Nazir, if his hair gets very heavy, he could go and trim it with a razor, and he also brings then 3 carbonos. We'll say, by the way, Rashi points out over here, maybe, it's the third to last line on the daf in Rashi. The kol taglachas v'taglachas gimel behemos chatos ola ushlamim. So I will say again, for the Nazir Olam, he's allowed to lighten his hair, trim every time it gets too heavy with a razor. But I will say, and when he does 3 carbonos, 3 animals. What are the 3 animals? A chatos, an ola, and the shlamim. Every single time he gets a trim. So the Gemara says furthermore, v'nitma, and if the Nazir Olam, the lifetime Nazir, becomes tameh, maybe carbon. I will say then what? He has to bring a carbon, ultimately again, like any other time. I will say, if you look at Rashi again, v'nitma maybe carbon tuma, keves ben shnasali asham, ushtei torim, ushtei b'nei yona. I will say that is the regular biblical offering that is brought when a Nazir becomes tameh and has to restart his neder naziris. Now remember, in this case, he's not restarting. Why is he not restarting? Because he's a lifetime Nazir anyway. But Lamaise, it brings the same carbonos of tuma. Incredible. On the flip side, Nazir Shimshon, if a person is a Shimshon Nazir, Hichbid Saro, if his hair becomes very heavy, Eino Mekel Batar, he can't take a trim. No trim. I will say Amadeus. Furthermore, Ve'eno maybe carbon tuma. And I will say there is no carbon tuma that he brings as well. No carbon tuma. Now the Gemara suggests, carbon udalo maisi. Now it sounds like, what doesn't he bring? He doesn't bring a carbon. Aval Nazirus chayla alei. But ultimately, again, the Nazirus is chal on him. Meaning what I will say, it sounds like that when it comes to Nazir Shimshon, so we'll say, so right, we're just contrasting the 2 constructs of Nazirus. So Nazir Olam, if your hair gets too heavy, you could take a trim, gotta bring carbonos. You become tameh, gotta bring carbonos. Nazir Shimshon, hair becomes too heavy, cannot trim, and if you become tameh, you don't bring carbonos. That was the Gemara infers. Sounds like for a Nazir Shimshon, it's only that if you become tameh, you don't have to bring carbonos. But you're still not allowed to become tameh, right? In other words, let's be clear. The Nazir Shimshon, if you go ahead and you become tameh, you don't have to bring carbonos. But lamaisa, there is still a prohibition to become tameh. So many masnisan, Abba say, whose opinion does this reflect? Lo Rabbi Shimon. Abba say, again, this idea that a Nazir Shimshon cannot become tameh doesn't seem to be in conformance with Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Shimon. This Sanya, here we go. Rabbi Yehuda says, this is crazy. Not crazy, chas v'shalom. This is interesting. Nazir Shimshon mutar tameh. Rabbi say, a person who takes a Nazir Shimshon, right, a Shimshon Nazirus, can become tameh to Mason. Wow. Rabbi which is like flies in the face, right? Everything I've learned in the last 3 days, right, of Nazir. So I have a whole 3 days into Nazir. But again, this is wild. So Nazir Shimshon is mutter to become Tamei L'Mesim. Shkimatzinu b'Shimshon shenitma. Now why is that? Because Shimshon became Tamei Tumas Meis. I will say, when did Shimshon become Tamei Tumas Meis? Shimshon killed a whole lot of people. Right? So I will say, he's killing people. So Ein Tumas Meis Gidol Mizo. So we see by Shimshon, Rabbi says, so again, it makes sense. Where does a Nazir Shimshon come from? Take a wild guess. Shimshon, right? Shimshon became Tamei Tumas Meis. So therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says, a Nazir Shimshon could also become Tamei Tumas Meis. Rabbi Shimon says, no. Ha'omer Nazir Shimshon lo Amar Klum. Rabbi says, it's very interesting. Rabbi Shimon says, a person who says, Hareini Nazir Shimshon has not said anything. Why? Now we'll say, we'll have to see exactly what Rabbi Shimon is saying. Because what Rabbi Shimon makes it sound like there's no such thing as Nazir Shimshon. Why is there no such thing as Nazir Shimshon? Well, remember again, we'll talk about this. How did Shimshon become a Nazir? Right? The Malach told his mother that the boy is going to be a Nazir. In other words, Shimshon was Kadosh Merechem. So Rabbi Shimon says, there's no construct like this. There's no construct of Nazir Shimshon. Because Rabbi say, you can't say Hareini Nazir Shimshon because no one ever voluntarily undertook a Nazir Shimshon. That was a conferred status. So the Gemara says money. So therefore, Rabbi say, when we say that halacha l'maisa, that a Nazir Shimshon can become can't become Tamei Tumas Meis, whose opinion is that? Rabbi Yehuda. So if you want to say Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda says that a Nazir Shimshon is permitted even lechatchila to expose himself to tumah, right, to become tamei. So the Gemara says, mani Rabbi Yehuda amar afilu lechatchila umasnisin katani im nitma. Now we'll say our Mishnah says, if the Nazir Shimshon becomes tamei, he doesn't have to bring karbanos. Which sounds like what? L'chatchila, he can't become tamei. B'diavad, if he became tamei, there's no karbanos. Rabbi Shimon, if it's Rabbi Shimon, Amar lo chayla alei nazirus klal. If it's Rabbi Shimon, halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Shimon says there's no such thing as Nazir Shimshon. To which the Gemara says, you're right. The Olam Rabbi Yehuda. In reality, it reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Va'aidi diktani gabi Nazir olam im nitma. Tana nami gabe Nazir Shimshon im nitma. The boss is incredible. The Mishnah is just trying to preserve Mishnaic symmetry. In reality, I will say, the Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon, which means what, Rabbi? I'm sorry, of Rabbi Yehuda. What does Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi say? That a Nazir Shimshon is what? Mutter lechatchila, to become Tumei Tumas Meis, which is another way of saying that what? Tumas Meis does not apply to Nazir Shimshon. And the Mishnah is just trying to preserve Mishnaic symmetry. Lema b'plukta dani tanai. So we'll say, let's say that this is embedded in a machloges tanai. What's the machloges tanai? Here we go. Harei alai kibechar. So we'll see, very interesting. Let's say, what's the case here? Take a look at Rashi on the top. Rashi, left-hand column, 3 lines in. Harei alai kikarzu. We'll say a person has a loaf of bread. And what do I say? I say this loaf of bread should be like a bachar. I will say, remember again, bachar is a firstborn animal, has kidusha. So I say this animal should be like a bachar. Rabbi Yaakov says that the loaf is aser. Rabbi Yossi says that it is mutter. That is mutter. Now remember again, we actually saw this sugya in Nidarim. So I will say, what am I doing over here? Essentially, I'm making a neder to make this loaf aser. Now I will say, when you want to make something that is mutter aser, you could do that through the mechanism called hatfasa. Hatfasa means you attach it to something that is aser. We'll say, so what's the machlokes by hatfasa? In order for that to work, does the what we'll call the source prohibited item, does it have to be also something that is aser through a neder, or could it be even something that is inherent there? So remember this machlokes? So we'll say, here we go. Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yossi Matir. My love, here we go. My love, Rabbi Yehuda, Shabbos say, what's the logic over here? Rabbi Yaakov holds that halacha l'maisa, when you use hatfasa, the source isser item could be inherently usher. It doesn't have to be usher through a neder, and it still works. Rabbi Yossi says, no. The only way for hatfasa to work is to link the permitted item to a prohibited item when the prohibited item itself is only usher through a neder. So just like the prohibited item is usher through a neder, so to what? The permitted item will become usher through a neder as well. So my love, Rabbi Yehuda Savar like Rabbi Yossi. I'm sorry, Rabbi Yehuda Savar like Rabbi Yaakov. Doesn't Rabbi Yehuda hold like Rabbi Yaakov? Namely, that's what the Amar lo ba'inan davar hanidar. Rabbi will say, in order for hatfasa to work, you do not need the source item to be usher through a neder. Rather, even if it's inherently usher, it still works. Rabbi Shimon Savar like Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Shimon holds like Rabbi Yossi. The Amar ba'inan davar hanidar. You need something. Rabbi will say, in order for hatfasa, in order for you to link a permitted item to a prohibited item, and make the permitted item prohibited, the prohibited item has to be usher through a neder, and therefore you can make the permitted item usher through a neder as well. To which the Gemara says, lo. Dichuli alma ba'inan davar hanidar. Shabbos is very interesting. Everyone agrees that when you're using the mechanism of hatfasa, let's remember again, what's hatfasa? You want to link a permitted item to a prohibited item and say, just like the prohibited item is asr, so do I make a neder to make the permitted item asr as well. Everyone agrees. I will say, when does that work? When the prohibited source item is not inherently asr, but it's also only asr through a neder. Then I can make another neder linking the permitted item ultimately to the prohibited item. Everyone agrees with that. B'shani gai b'char, b'char is different. Why? D'chsiv bei lahashem. I will say the pasuk by Bechar says La Hashem. Then what does that teach me? L'rabos es habachar. So if you take a look at Rashi once again, Rashi says V'shayni kavi bachar tarutam Rabbi Yaakov mishum diksiv La Hashem ish ki yidor neder La Hashem l'rabos es habachar. They will say Bechar may be the exception to this rule. That since it says by Bechar La Hashem and it says by Nidarim La Hashem, so therefore, you could use the Bechar, even though the Bechar is inherently Asr, you could use the Bechar as the source item for Hatfasa. Okay, getting a little technical over here. To which the Gemara Rabbi Yossi Amar Lecha, Hahu LaHashem B'Bailei L'Rabos Chatas V'Asham. So Rabbi Yossi will say, no, that LaHashem comes to include what? Chatas and Asham. The Rabbi will say, if I go and I take a loaf of bread, and I say this loaf of bread should be like a Chatas and an Asham, the loaf of bread becomes Asr. To which the Gemara says, "Uma ra'is l'rabos chatas va'asham ulhotzi esabachar." So Rabbi Yossi, why do you include chatas and asham and exclude bachar? I'll tell you why. Mar bani chatas asham shekimat fisim beneder. Chatas and asham are different. Why Rabbi Yossi? Because how does something become aser through a chatas as a chatas and an asham through a neder? Therefore, Rabbi Yossi makes sense. See, something that becomes itself aser through a neder could serve for hatfasa, could be linked then to something that is permitted to make that permitted item asr through a neder. And I'll go ahead and exclude bechar. Why, Rabbi say? Because bechar is inherently asr. Because it's inherently asr, therefore it can't serve as a source for hatfasa. Rabbi Yaakov, bechar nami matfisa beneder. Rabbi Yaakov holds no, that Bechar could also become the source for Hatfasa. How so? The Sanya, Rabbi say, here we go. The Sanya, shall base Rabbeinu Amru. Rabbi say, in the house of Rabbi they said, Minayin l'nolod lo Bechar b'soch edro, shemitzvah v'lakdisho. Rabbi say, how do we know that when you have a Bechar animal, it's important to actively be makdish it, to actively consecrate it. Shneimar hazakar takdish. So we'll say, so again, it's by Bechar, what are you supposed to do? Listen, you have a Bechar animal, what are you supposed to do? Hareizu Bechar. You're supposed to actively consecrate it. So you see over here that Bechar itself also has like a shtickle endowed status. Rabbi Yossi will say to you, Nihi de mitzvah lahakdisho. Even though again it is a mitzvah to consecrate the Bechar, Ilo makdish le milo kadosh. Rabbi say at the end of the day by Bechar, if you did not consecrate it, is it still not consecrated? In other words, there may be a mitzvah to go out of your way and to consecrate the Bechar animal. But tell me, if you didn't consecrate it, is the Bechar animal still consecrated? Gabi Nazir nami haksiv la Hashem. But by Nazir it also says la Hashem. Shabbos already do with that. So the Bible listens to this. We'll just end with this. Rabbi say that la Hashem is necessary for the following thing. Rabbi say this is so beautiful. Rabbi Shmuel Silber. Rabbi Shmuel Silber says, Miyamai Lo achalti asham nazir tameh. Rabbi Shimon says as follows: I never ate. Rabbi Shimon wasn't right. We'll say this is Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik was a Kohen. Shimon HaTzadik says, I never ate of the offerings of a Nazir who became Tameh. Right? Remember again, a Nazir becomes Tameh, has to offer up a Chatas, an Asham, and an Olah. Shimon HaTzadik said, never in my life did I ever partake of those Kabbalah. So we'll say, now we're going to say very quickly, we'll say, why did Shimon HaTzadik never partake of it? Why did he never partake of it? We'll say, because remember again, what's the problem with we learned this yesterday. What's the problem with a Nazir who becomes Tameh? What do we have to be concerned about? What do we have to be concerned about? He's going to regret ever having made the neder. And when he brings his karbanos, what is it like? What is it like? Chulin ba'azara. So Shimon HaTzadik says, I never ate of the offerings of a Nazir. Chutz me'adam echad, except for one guy. Listen to this. Sheba ilai min adaram. He came to me from the south of Eretz Yisrael, and I will say, Shimon HaTzadik, he describes this very, very quickly. Yefei einayim v'tov roi, beautiful eyes, good looking, kitzosav sedur saltan, beautiful hair. Amarti lo bni, mara'isa l'shachi seyar no'ezeh. My son, why are you destroying such beautiful hair? Why are you destroying such beautiful hair? Amrali ro'a hayisi la'aba be'iri. I was a shepherd for my father in his city. V'alachti lisho mayim min hamayan. I went to go ahead and draw water from the well. V'nistakalti beva'asha, and I saw my reflection in the water. Upachaz yitzriala, and I saw, wow, I am one good-looking guy. I'll say, right? We all have those moments, right? I am one good-looking guy. I'll say, and now what happens? Now you realize in that moment, with looks like this, I could do a lot of damage, right? With looks like this, right, I could have anything and anyone. Ubikesh latardani min ha'ol. My Yitzhahara was ready to remove me from the world. Amarti, I said to my Yitzhahara, Reka, empty one. Why are you becoming haughty, arrogant in a world that is not yours? In the end, you're just going to disintegrate into the dust. I will shave you off for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Shimon HaTzadik hears this story. Amarti, I stood up. Shimon HaTzadik says, then Ashaktiv al-Shai, kissed him on his head. Amarti, I said to him, Kimoscha yirbu nazirim b'Yisrael. There should be more Nazirim like you in Klal Yisrael. About you it said, Ish kiyafli lindar neder nazir lazir la'Hashem. About such a person, I will say, that is a nazir la'Hashem. So we'll have to stop over here for today. So we're leaving off a little bit mid-topic. This machlok is still Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Huda. About, again, I will say, the construct. So I will say, just to point out, the one thing we've left off with, I will say, is still not knowing whether or not halacha l'maisa Nazirus Shimshon. First, is there Nazirus Shimshon? And number two, halacha l'maisa, does Nazirus Shimshon come with an Isser Tumah or not? And Mir HaTzadik the Bikitin, I will say, Shkoyach.
Right? He can then go ahead and make my self-insert is up. Right? That's not an Israel and Isser.
That will be
totally separate.
No, that will be Isser Chalal Isser. That's Isser Chalal Isser. Right. That's why it's Isser Chalal Isser.
It's only taking the parts I need as one part. Now the Zog is, it's not on top of the parts I need. It's a totally different